This week's Welcome to Mystara is a very special episode because it's been 3 years since I put up my very first video, complete with the crap sound and me sounding a lot deeper than I should have because I think I was getting over a chest cold. Before I actually started writing things down and what I was trying to say or even learning how to use the audio software, I'd try to make it through 15 minutes straight of extemporaneous dialogue without error. I'm not really proud of the early stuff, but I learned and I got better. This week I'm going to spill the beans on the Mystara Player's Guide and the process I went through writing a gaming book and all the fun that it entailed, from hurricanes to floods to a divorce to fires and everything in between. I'm Mr. Welch and this is how the Mystara Player's Guide came to be. So flashback to 5 years ago. Wizards announces the DM's Guild is going to open and older settings are going to be returning to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition via the Guild, though with certain exceptions. I was still reading and trying to understand 5th edition, because I had completely given up on 4th edition, and the idea that Mystara might be getting new content was fantastic. So I started jotting down ideas and notes on how Mystara would look in the new rules. I won't lie, 5th edition was a lot easier to make a setting book than for, say, 3rd edition, mainly because half of the 3rd edition books would be nothing but character stat blocks. So I broke out my computer, set up my Microsoft Word, and started learning how to do book layout. That's when I learned I knew nothing. There was a lot of mistakes, but I hadn't spent a dime on it yet. Word is not layout software. That's something that if you're going to write a book, you need to get before you get anything else. The right tool for the right job. The original version I created that I actually showed to other people was about 80 pages, and it looked like crap. A friend of mine asked me to put it up on his webpage, and that's the infamous version 27 that I can't even stand to look at today because it was so crude compared to the current edition. Most people think of that version when they hear of the book, but it's like people bragging about the tricycle you built when you were 5 while you're currently trying to assemble a Corvette. All the art was filler taken off the internet. This book was never going to get used outside of my gaming group anyways. I showed it to some people, then I got told flat out the early editions were terrible. I had no idea how 5th edition worked completely. I still used archaic terms like the 10-minute turn, and 5th edition didn't give out feats to races or classes as a bonus. So I had to go back to the drawing board. So I practically started over. Found this free layout software called Lucid. It was free for a while, but when you start making the book with any amount of pictures, it gets really expensive really quickly. I hate renting software, especially if I stop paying them and I don't get access to anything I've already done. So just a word of warning, if you get a layout program, buy it outright. Don't do these rental programs where you never own the software. But I digress. Lucid was good for what it did. The book went from looking like a high school project to an actual game book. I started keeping track of all the changes that were being made. Then the Guild went live in 2016, still with the promise of expanding it to the old classic settings. It was time to get serious. I called an artist that I'd worked with before. This wasn't my first game. That would be Con, the card game from 10 years ago, at least the one that I created and made. I've worked for other gaming companies before in the past. Con was a fantastic game, but I never could get it sold in numbers enough to have it made in massive numbers. I sold a ton, but the profit margin wasn't enough to justify mass production. But then again, it was just a one-man show doing that. Maybe one day I'll get it out again. But I was working with an artist I met at A-Con named Misha. She was a struggling artist and I was a struggling game designer, so we hitched our wagons together and created Con. She drew the art, I wrote the words. We tried it the other way around, it wasn't pretty. But she was my first go-to when I needed art. Then I hooked up with my friend Jimbo Burrell from my days at Reaper, and he gave me a few pieces of art to help me to get along with it. Plus, I also wanted to keep artists that I'd worked with in the past involved in the project. So that led to me taking on the role of art editor, something I should have expected but I wasn't quite prepared for. Mystara had not had any new art since 1996. Large chunks of monsters and races never saw a single piece of art, or the art that was drawn was pretty bad. So this was my chance. The very first piece of art for Mystara in 5th edition was going to be the Shadow Elf Shaman. It was the first standalone color art of a Shadow Elf Shaman. The only other art I could find for Mystara was the Caldwell cover of the magazine. I sent Misha all the reference material I had on that character to give her everything she needed for references. And fortunately, since Mystara is based heavily on history, references were easy to come by. Art isn't cheap, by the way. The book cost me thousands, almost all on art, with the layout software also not exactly being inexpensive, but since I was renting it, I tried setting up a donation site to help defray the expenses, and I got taken down literally overnight when I got a message from Up on High saying if I used crowdfunding to pay for the art, it would disqualify the book forever from appearing on the Guild. Take it down immediately or else. Well, that was the end of that, as I don't think I got to reading the end of the email before I'd already taken it down. All the art you see in the book is paid for out of my pocket. I followed the Wizard's rules word for word and did nothing to jeopardize this book from getting out. Setting-wise, I came to a crossroads early, and that was dealing with the Mystara fluff compared to the new stuff from the Forgotten Realms that dominated 5th edition. Dragonborn are a new addition to D&D, and they don't fit in with Mystara. Like I've said repeatedly, Mystara has a ton of reptilian races. Dragonborn were redundant. Despite what a lot of people not familiar with the setting say, Mystara is not a sandbox, despite the large number of creatures. It's diverse, yes, but it doesn't fit in with the sandbox settings because there are hard limits. So the option I had was to keep with the 5e openness where everything has to be allowed regardless of whether it makes a lick of sense, or do I stick with the settings fluff and tell people races like tieflings, halflings, and drow don't exist. That's when I read the sidebar of page 33 in the Player's Handbook, and I'm reading it verbatim. Dragonborn and the rest of the races in this chapter are uncommon. They don't exist in every world of Dungeons & Dragons. There was my answer. I was sticking to the original version. This also came to a head when dealing with new classes. Sorcery wasn't a Mystaran concept. It went against everything Mystaran magic was built on. Wild magic has no place in Mystara. Our weird magic actually makes the magic more stable, not less. Dragons don't have the same place in Mystara's background, especially with the inability to crossbreed, so dragon blood didn't make much sense. Other classes also had problems fitting in, like the Warlock or the Barbarian. Warlocks don't sync up with the way magic sources work in Mystara. Barbarians, on the other hand, have always been a terrible class to begin with, so I threw out the parts that didn't work, but at least I tried to fit the classes back into Mystara as best I could. Warlocks get their magic from outside sources from the known world. Sorcerers don't use traditional forms of sorcery like in the Player's Handbook, but magic unique to Mystara. And barbarians have been shoved into the outskirts of the setting where they can be boring one-dimensional characters from the sidelines. Then I decided to start restricting things based on the old setting across the board. I'm an old hand at writing. I've done it all my life. Told my father I wanted to be a writer and he asked why I just couldn't be gay. I've worked at Red Pub magazine for probably over a decade now. The number of articles and pieces I've had published over the years number over 1,000 easily. I've edited more pieces than I can remember, and I've spiked more than a few that couldn't be salvaged. They were so badly written. But when I put you on a hard word count and you give me an article that goes over the page count by a factor of 10, I'm not publishing it and you're not getting paid. I only have so much space available, and word counts exist for that very reason. The point of that aside is an old bit of wisdom that every writer, game designer, and anyone else that puts pen to paper needs to carve into their eyeballs. What you leave out is just as important as what you put in. Mystara is old school Dungeons & Dragons, back when we had racial limits on who could play what. Starting with 3rd edition, everybody could play everything. But unlike other settings, Mystara actually had reasons why dwarves couldn't use magic other than because Tolkien said they didn't. Rockborn dwarves are quite resistant to arcane magic. They had to be. The Radiance was killing everybody else from the fallout and the dwarves were dying. So the Rockborn dwarves lost the ability to use arcane magic and at the same time got resistance to magic because of the result of their creation. I used this restriction sparingly. Only the She have a similar restriction, unable to use divine magic because the Immortals and the Archfey really have no allegiance to each other. So I had to look at the races, because that was another change Mystara had. We don't have a lot of the racial subtypes of other settings. The Drow were gone. That wasn't even a question. You ask a Mystara player what's the difference between our elves and the Forgotten Realms elves, and they will proudly puff out their chest and say, no Drow. Hell, you ask a Dragonlance, Birthright, or Darksun player, they'll give you the same answer. Pretty sure Ravenloft got made Drow-free when Bloodspurt got hammered in the TSR nuke phase during the Grand Conjunction. Half-orcs aren't possible because of the breeding restrictions. I actually kept half-elves in Mystara, by the way. They were mentioned in the Savage Coast, but I made them a creation of the Red Curse, and they're an actual full-blooded race rather than just hybrids. But they're so far away that finding them in the known world is quite rare. So go watch the video on Mystara half-elves for information on the Raldas. But back on topic. Gnomes were easy. There's 2 types of gnomes in D&D. There's 2 types of gnomes in Mystara. The fluff didn't fit perfectly, but the rules did. Sky gnomes were the rock gnomes, with their focus on tinkering and building things. They live in a giant flying city with Magitech biplanes. I couldn't have written a better race for sky gnomes if I wanted to. Hill gnomes were the forest gnomes, as they are both the stereotype for D&D gnomes. If the rules fit and the name doesn't, change the name. Filing off serial numbers from rules you need for your setting is a time-honored D&D tradition going back to the very beginning. Halflings were a problem, as Mystara halflings are a single race. It's a major plot point. The Hin have been through hell and back, and their only strength is their unity. There was 2 races of halflings to start with, but neither fit the bill well, so it was time for the Hin halflings. Making a race in 5th edition is pretty easy. +2 to a stat, +1 to another stat, 4 abilities. Done. Then you get the sub-races, which is +1 to a stat and 1 ability, with the core race providing the +2 and the 3 abilities. So just get rid of the other 2 sub-races, make the Hin their own sub-race, and there you go. We now have halflings in Mystara. Mystara does have 3 dwarven races, and 2 of them are completely atypical. Modrig's Ward were right out as a playable race. I wanted to keep them the big bads anyway, so that wasn't a problem. The Kogalar and the Hollow World obviously weren't going to be seen on the surface, and I didn't have to do much with them since the rules for Hill Dwarves fit their description almost exactly, except they left out the part for their love of lederhosen and yodeling. That must have been an accident. That left the Rockborn. They were the only playable dwarf race in Mystara, and it made sense. The Great Rain of Fire wiped out the rest. After a lot of playtesting, they finally fell into a playable sub-race, and I'm actually kind of proud of them. Compared to the Hin and the Dwarves, Mystara loves a huge variety of elves. They had so many sub-races I lost count. I did remove the trance ability from the elves. It didn't fit in with the lore, and it was such a minor ability I never got a single complaint from any playtesters. It was more fluff than anything in the first place. I did raise a few eyebrows with my initial picks where the Sylvan elves were wood elves. People thought they should be the high elves, but they live in the woods of Alfheim. That makes them wood elves. The Belkades, the Spanish elves of Glantry, were the high elves with their magic and all. They had one very minor change where they just switched out one weapon proficiency for another. The Viala got reskinned from the Eladrin and the DMG, not the revised version that was added later. A minor gripe. Never put playable stuff in the DMG or similar. That doesn't help your players. Then it came to the Shadow Elves, which is what everybody wanted to see. How do they replace the Drow? Well, they aren't much to look at rules-wise because they don't have 4 different abilities like the Drow do. A new skill, different dark vision, and a slight change in weapon proficiency that was pretty much a neutral balance. But that was it. They didn't replace the Drow. The Drow were never in Mystara to begin with, so there was nothing to replace. Okay, enough talk about actual playtest notes. I started to ramble there. People expected new races, because new setting, new races. One issue a lot of people have with Mystara is that it's known as the furry setting because of the large number of anthro creatures found in here. And I'm not going to lie, they do have a point. I can't remove a canon race, though, just because I don't like the way people play them. If that were the case, all the Kinder and Dragonlance would have caught the plague a long time ago. But what I could do was give them enough background that could actually have something other than just Dogman or Catgirl as their only trait. I took out 4 races, so I added 4 races. I grabbed the She from Tall Tales of the Wee Folk because of that masterpiece needed some attention in 5th edition. The rules were tough trying to fit all the old stuff from Tall Tales into 5th edition with the 4 rules per race template. But in 5th edition, if a race gets a negative trait, they usually get a 5th trait to balance it out. So, aside from no divine magic, I gave them vulnerability to iron weapons. Made complete sense. That's the classic weakness of Fae from folklore. None of the playtesters argued that it wasn't appropriate, it's just that it made the She frontline fighters a bit impractical. Not that it didn't stop them. I swear from my playtest notes, none of the people that played a She character must have rolled higher than a 5 for wisdom the way they played their characters. But let's get on to the furries. I actually wrote the rules for Tortles at the very beginning, back about 4 or 5 years ago. Their rules were similar to the 5th edition rules that came out a few years later, though I didn't do the shell giving you AC 17 and that's it. Instead, it was calculated by adding the proficiency bonus to the constitution bonus because the shell hardened as the Tortle aged. This later got tweaked for mechanical reasons, but then the Tortle was borged by the Forgotten Realms, and suddenly I had a race that wasn't unique to Mystara, and I shelved it and replaced it with another race. Phanatons got added as this late addition, which annoyed Misha because she had to change the race chart to remove the Tortle and add the Phanaton. I took the rules from a magic item from the Princes of the Apocalypse for gliding, and made them adventurous types, but very poor fighters because they couldn't wear heavy armor or carry big stuff and still fly. They were an immediate hit with the players, who also chided me not to give into the realms taking our Tortles and to put the Mystaran Tortles back into the game. So Misha was spared the task of erasing her art and just drew a Phanaton flying over the head of the halfling and the gnome. Then it came time for the 2 furriest of the furry races. The Phanaton was a pure fantasy creation, a hybrid of various animals, but not based on anyone in particular. The Lupin and Rakasta, however, were dog and cat people. The trick was variety. Lupin tended to look like wolfmen in recent art, but I wanted to go back to the classic design so they could appear to be any domesticated breed. So I broke them into 3 subclasses based on breed size. That worked wonders. When we ran an all-Lupin campaign through Curse of Strahd, we ended up with a Valhund Barbarian, a Corgi Paladin, a Bloodhound Ranger, a Sheepdog Cleric, a Mastiff Rogue, and a Pug Wizard, named Fez the Necessary, who redefined the definition of neurotic. But I'm going to make him canon if I ever get the chance. The variation helped as every Lupin suddenly could take on different aspects of all sorts of dogs. The Rakasta were a little tricky in changing because instead of breeds, their sub-races centered around living size or location. Unlike Tabaxi, which are just leopard people, Rakasta are all manners of cats. You'll probably hear more about the Rakasta versus Tabaxi because last week that topic only lost by 2 votes. You got greater Rakasta, which are just the big cats. Feral and domesticated Rakastas either live in the wilderness or the city, but that was their only real difference. They were still just based on house cats. Fluff-wise, Rakasta focused on their love of adventure and their love of luxury. Players played them like house cats in a dungeon, grooming themselves after every battle, picking their treasure based on how fashionable it looked. It was a bit campy, but everybody had fun. Right about this time, I started getting help from outside sources. Thorfinn Tate, master cartographer of Mystara, offered me his maps with a few restrictions. This saved me a ton of money on having them drawn, because in fantasy artist hierarchy, cartographers sit at the top in terms of cost. Map making is very demanding and quite precise. You have an error drawing your elf, and her ear looks slightly bent. You make an error drawing a map, and Cleveland is suddenly in Iowa. Cartographers charge a mint compared to an artist of similar skill. Marco Del Monte offered me his use of the Codex Immortalis, which saved hours of writing up the various immortals. Again, there were restrictions attached on what I could change, but where I couldn't skew Thorfinn's map a single pixel, I could edit the codex for space and translation issues. Still, it was 15 pages of immortals that I didn't have to write. Then I tried converting the secret crafts of magic, a staple of why Glantry is superior to just about everybody in the arcane arts, into the 5th edition rules. Back at the very beginning with the Unearthed Arcana, Mystara tried prestige classes. They weren't very good, but they were things at least for a little while. That was the only way I could figure out how to fit the secret crafts into 5th edition. I couldn't make them a subclass, the advancement charts for wizards didn't support it. Feats were an idea, but again, the system didn't support feat chains very well. So prestige classes it was. Wasn't a popular option. Several people said that they were going to take them and make them better. They later came back and said never mind, they hit the exact same walls I did trying to recreate them. They were never a popular option. We tried to play test them by forcing people to try it out rather than do it organically through natural choice in campaigns. Problem was they are very high-level options. 5th edition doesn't do high-level play very well, and while prestige classes for secret class weren't a good option, they happened just to be the best option regardless. Art-wise, I started bringing in additional artists for the project. I wanted immortals to look different than the mortals, so I got my friend Leo Madrano to draw in his style, so there would be an alien look to the immortals themselves. The art was purely padding, but I also wanted the book to look pretty. I hired Faith McLaughlin to do the nation art. She hand-drew a scene from every different nation. Unfortunately, the art was going to look better in other projects, so I repurposed it for the individual nation books, where the hand-drawn aspect made those books look like somebody was, sketching it rather than a photograph. I hired Rick Hershey, who had done art for Green Ronin on the advice of some friends in the industry. He made me some masterpieces like the Von Hendricks art and the Serene art, but the later pieces didn't fit in very well. After some issues with the last pieces, I realized I couldn't use all the art. In the meantime, I hired Sierra Grilliot for some later art in the cleric section, as Misha was having scheduling issues. And for the same reason, Avgi Kanaka came in to took on some of the filler pieces because Rubus was suffering from an eye injury. But that brings me to Rubus. He was highly recommended to me by a mutual friend who says he's going to be the next big upcoming fantasy artist, and hire him while he's affordable. I contacted him and asked him about working for the book. He's in Greece, which means the exchange rate was beneficial, but that also means that he could charge a lot of money in Greece and not cost a lot over here in the States. His price has gone up, by the way, dramatically. For what would end up being his job interview, he offered to draw me something simple for free. Just some swords. He was hired. He drew several objects like the coins of Vestlands and the gladiator helmets, and he finally stopped to tell me that to think bigger because I was wasting his talents. So we moved on to action scenes, and that was the start of a beautiful friendship. Now, more on that one later. I get to the chapter on magic and decide I'm going to convert all the spells from Mystara to 5th edition. This wasn't the best idea, as some 2nd edition magic doesn't translate well, because 5th edition doesn't understand how alignment works, and the spells tend to reflect that. Initially, it doesn't look that bad, as I'm going from book to book taking all the spells and converting them. And then I forgot Glantry, Kingdom of Magic, was written by Monty Cook, the guy that believes the term quadratic wizards and linear fighters is written somewhere in the Bible. Cue the flood of spells as 2nd edition Glantry has more spells than the rest of all the books in Mystara combined. Some of them are almost impossible to convert to 5th edition rules because of their complexity. Spout of Scalding Wrath has 2 damage types and the saving throw only adjusts one of them. Others were needlessly wordy, quite complicated, or so situational to be practically useless. I included them all, though a large chunk of them only vaguely resemble the original spell. I've got Misha cranking out the art. I am writing up new subclasses and background stuff as fast as I can, and paying artists what I can when I can get just a little bit of spare cash. I'm selling games to make this book work. And that's when things started to get rocky. I was working at a game store that played really fast and loose with their books, as well as an owner that decided I was costing him money because he had to pay me more than he wanted. The job ended in a shouting match in front of customers because he was pissed we were only having an average day. So I had to find another job. Got one with a food delivery place because it was hiring on the spot, and later found out that those Uber and Favor and Grubhub delivery places don't really pay much more than minimum wage because they don't reimburse you for car use at all. So now the art's coming in at a snail's pace because money. Gotta pay the artists, people. Well, I'm unloading magic cards to pay rent thanks to the game store guy effectively cooking the books to underreport sales dramatically so he didn't have to pay me commissions. And I was unloading dual lands. It was that bad. I hit another snag. I was getting negative feedback over the art. I'm old school. Don't mind a bit of skin in my art. I remember when first edition even had nipples. Looking at you, Loviatar, and your finished nakedness that was later borged into the realms. But some people today get a visceral reaction if they see clothing that isn't Victorian in coverage. And that's a noticeable theme in 5th edition art. Women are covered neck to ankle in clothes in most art. There's a few exceptions, but looking through the books, you will see almost every woman is in full armor with long sleeves and no exposed skin except for the head. And here I am with a nation based on the Pacific Islands. I got some grief because a few pieces of art had women that weren't drawn to the standards of the Victorian era. One of them you could even see her nipples. 2 pieces by Rubus also had visible nipples if you zoomed into 500% and squinted really hard. That's when Rubus got me back my hero chapter art that I paid him to replace the original art because I just wasn't satisfied with it. And that's when I got to see the succubus boobies. That's when the complaints really started. That's also when I had to make a decision on what hill I wanted to die on. D&D is supposed to be fantasy friendly, but it's also got mature themes based entirely on the fact that a large portion of the rules are devoted to the mathematical odds of stabbing people to death. So after a lot of discussion, I agreed the nipples had to go. The overt ones, meaning the Polynesian woman and the succubus were getting bras. The Toa wasn't sexy. She was Brock Samson naked. She was naked because it enhanced the feel of the kill, not to entice you. The succubus is a chaotic evil sex demon. Pretty sure they don't care about covering up to avoid offending people's sensitivities. I wasn't touching the pixel nips. If you're zooming in to find a single dot that might represent areola, you're probably the same kind of person playing Black Sabbath backwards, looking for dirty words. I didn't take out some of the more violent images, though the blood was removed, because apparently violence isn't bad if there's no blood. I did have one playtester get upset about the dead succubus in the hero image, but not one word on the other dead demons. The hypocrisy of the selective outrage was not lost on me. That Nalfeshni had a mother. Well, probably. Not 100% sure on how Nalfeshni breed, but I'm assuming they're mammals. For the battle scenes, the blood was deleted, though that wasn't many scenes. The violence is still there, but the lack of blood makes it better and more acceptable somehow. Then of all things that happened to help the book along, it was Hurricane Harvey. Somehow, despite my city being 90% underwater, my power didn't go out at all. So I got to sit and write and finish the core chunks of the book. We got so much playtesting done, and the feedback came in, and I made even more changes. I did lose my job, but when another one popped up almost immediately, I took it. There was a lot of people that lost everything and just couldn't come to work anymore. New job paid a ton. Then the house burns down right after Thanksgiving because the neighbor's kid put out a grease fire with a bucket of water. I lose almost everything except the game collection because of a strange quirk in the design of the house that funneled the smoke away from the game room. I did get a very nice insurance settlement because the city was rebuilding from Harvey. Everything was on sale. So I replaced all the furniture and the computer with brand new stuff. It was like 60% off from all the stores helping the city to rebuild. I used the remaining insurance money to finally get a proof of the book printed. And then I discovered it wasn't ready at all. There were typos. Art problems abounded with the layout. The tables looked like crap. Though that was the fault of the software more than anything. Not sure why layout software can't seem to do tables right, but that seems to be a reoccurring problem. After the ex left, because of reasons outside the scope of writing a game, I was actually able to have friends without her approval and go play games without constant check-ins. So maybe that was in the scope of writing the game. I was able to go to popular gaming conventions, hoping to show off what I've done to people that could help me get it published once the book was finished. Everybody was impressed. But old guard TSR has no pull at Wizards of the Coast, and the Wizards people that I met were more on the logistical side than the publication side. I did have one guy take a keen interest in the book, telling me everything I did wrong after asking to look at it. The cover art had to be changed. The art style needed to be made at least uniform from chapter to chapter. The tables had to be fixed. Well, that I already knew. Then he started giving me minute changes like move a line up here, kill an orphan there. Technical changes that only somebody that has been doing this for years on end could just eyeball it. Only after tearing the book apart, he told me it looked great and then introduced himself as Frank Mentzer. I took out a pen and paper and asked him to repeat every single line he said verbatim. So the day I got back to Houston, I went straight to the computer and made every single change he mentioned before I even unpacked. Paid Rubus to replace the rest of the chapter art with his versions. I had Misha replace the artists that worked in the second chapter with her versions, and more specifically, come up with an anime style for some of the art to appeal to people who only know Mystara from the Chronicles of Mystara video game series. Game was coming along great when I had playtester issues again, this time over mature subjects. I didn't think I had any mature subjects over the usual list of things you can do in an RPG but not in real life, like chop up corpses for spell components or stab people and take their stuff. But no, somebody in a game group read the list of crimes and punishments in the New World and discovered that Glantry punishes rapists by magical sex change. That guy spammed me with questions on that topic, throwing out hypothetical scenario after hypothetical scenario. Apparently I hit on his fetish. Yes, the game addressed the crime of rape, and by addressed I mean most of the time executed the offender. Except Glantry. Glantry's punishments for most crime were far more sadistic. The rape crime just fixated this guy. Finally I gave in and told him to shut up, change the punishment to baleful polymorph. So if you try to turn the punishment into a kink, they will be more than happy to turn you into something that you're not going to like. Later on, I think it was the same playtester, some people were playing in a blind game, one that I didn't watch so I could not influence their opinion. I got similar questions about the rune magic system, because the tester was obsessed with getting the right runes and breaking the game, despite the runic system being incredibly dangerous and quite difficult to actually get the rune you want. Ended up, the player was immediately trying to grab the rune at level 1, and if the character died, another one was made up exactly like the first one, who started the cycle all over again. This time I didn't change the system, I chalked it up to a problem player and moved on. But it did teach me a hard lesson about players and their obsessions, and at least more than I already knew. One of the last things I did to improve the page layout was to change the software from Lucid to Zara, which wasn't a subscription service, and then the book got even better. Lucid didn't let the text flow over transparent backgrounds, which led to a lot of dead space around art. Zara snapped the text around the art, which would have probably shaved off months, if not a year, if I had used that program from the beginning. The right tool for the right job, people. All I gotta say. I get Zara, and I immediately reformat the entire book to make it look a lot more professional, and it's day and night. Tried to match the font and size from the player's handbook, which wasn't easy. I finished the final book sometime last week. To paraphrase the guy who actually said this, who nobody really knows, editing is never finished, merely abandoned. Rubus got me the replacement cover art just this week, which was a bit of an adventure because I wanted to recreate the famous siege from a classic module. Originally it was going to be the beginning of Nightstar Terror, but that had dozens of goblins and other people and it was just way too crowded. So, bad idea. Get a better cover. Something to live by. Trust your artist. If they say something's not going to work for what you want to do, it's not going to work. He didn't know D&D Mystara modules very well, so we went down the list looking for an epic battle scene. Something eye-catching for new players and similar for old ones. It's a lot harder than you think. Nothing in the basic series caught his imagination. We already had art from the Isle of Dread in the module. Castle Amber was a good choice, but the module was about gothic horror. Any scene from there wouldn't make a lot of sense out of context or would be spoilers. But then we got to Temple of Death, and the image of the two elephantine fiends that were the Malfera moving to attack the adventurers caught his eye. Not going to lie, previous versions of the Malfera weren't good. They were described as 10-foot-tall demons from the Dimension of Nightmares, and instead, in the previous art, they looked like what a 5-year-old would draw if they were hearing the description of an elephant without ever seeing one before. I did allow myself a little bit of self-insert so that the party on the front cover is the actual very first D&D group I ever DM'd, because I DM'd more than I played because I was the only person willing to DM when I was young. So I'm sorry, Roger. Ogren has green skin and not gray skin on the cover. That can't be changed. He does have gray skin later on the book, though. But Tila, Halverick, Skeksis, Keegan, and Morgan, you're all perfect. But that's it. The book's done. It's 224 pages long. I wanted to make sure that it was longer than the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. All the art is original, created specifically for Mystara. It's got all the alternate classes from the Gazetteer series turned into subclasses. It's been playtested to death. It's been proofed more times than I care to count. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm already working on the DM's guide and statting out the monsters again, as my first attempt to try that was pretty bad. There's a ton of stuff to convert to 5th edition. There's also a lot of people that want to write a book in the new edition. I haven't even touched on the Red Coast, the Serpent Peninsula, or the Hollow World parts of Mystara. I've had some success in contacting people that can help get this published, though I can't say who for obvious reasons. I've had a ton of help, paid a small fortune to great artists, and I'm already looking ahead. Turns out every major setback I thought I encountered was helping me push this forward through various reasons. Even this lockdown has helped me, because it gave me the time I needed to finish the book entirely. So that's what I've been doing in the 3 years since I started this channel. So now it's time to talk about next week. I didn't have a poll last week because I was going to do this video regardless, but now it's time to add a new topic. And joining our 4 previous contestants is going to be Immortals versus Gods, talking about the power variations between our Immortals and the gods of other settings. Similar in style, but there are large differences in what they can do. Of course, you can pick any of the other previous 4 topics as well. But until next time, see you at the 4th anniversary.